All right, I guess we can go ahead and get underway. So I'd just like to officially say thank you for coming in and welcome to the webinar. We're going to be doing what amounts to an intro or kind of a basic run through on Power BI, sort of a general introduction. Here's the fundamentals of the program. Here's a little bit of how it works and try and explain some of the basics behind it. So this is not going to be a regular class such as we normally teach. Um, Nevertheless, I'll try to get some essentials and useful stuff across in the process. So my name's Seth Bonder. I'll be the presenter. And before I go any further, I'll just say, as I thank you for coming in. We're going to cover just a few essentials here today. Talk a little bit about the basics of running the program, getting the data in. Talk a little bit about connecting to data sources, and also doing a couple of the basic visuals in Power BI. But let me just say before I get in that if anybody's interested in taking the full class, what full class is, the next couple sessions that are going to be running will be early in March. We have a one-day version called Dashboard in a Day, which some people have found helpful. And you might want to also look into the full two-day class. You don't have to do both of the classes, of course. Might want to pick one or the other. But the March 6th and 7th Power BI Data Analysis Practitioner, that's the one that most end users have found to be helpful. So I would recommend that one. But you can look at the curriculum for the two classes and see which one might suit you a little bit better. If you only have the one day to spare, of course, you can do the March 5th version. But either way, this will be when the next couple of sessions are taking place, and you can check with our office on anything after that. So let me go ahead and tuck my little slide deck away here. And I'm going to go ahead and bring up Power BI itself. And I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about what Power BI is. I've actually had a number of people in class the last year or so who had heard about Power BI. They knew it existed, but they didn't know much more than that. And so I want to just start with a few words on what the program is for. Power BI is a program intended to assist with what's called business intelligence. And right off the bat, some people get a little nervous when they start hearing the techno jargon. Business intelligence simply means the information that goes into running a business. So if you hear terms like business intelligence, data analysis, data visualizations, all of these things are kind of part of the wanting to run the business more efficiently, make good decisions, keep things going, generate reasonable profit and keep everybody paid and happy, that sort of thing. And one of the nice things about business intelligence and data analysis now is that it doesn't require a mainframe the size of an office building to do the analysis. You also don't have to depend on specialized staff to do a lot of this data analysis stuff anymore, or at least not all the time. It is now possible, using a program like Power BI, to do, if you want to call it individual data analysis, if you want to call it, personal BI, self-service BI is another term that people are hearing. There are other programs that do the same sort of thing, but Power BI, at least the desktop version, has the advantage of being relatively easy to download, fairly easy to use, fairly easy to understand. If anybody wants to use it, if they've had a little bit of experience with programs like Microsoft Excel, they'll probably find that some aspects of Power BI are not too hard to pick up. And that, I think, is one of the advantages of this program. So let me just start by talking a little bit about the layout of the program, because it is similar in some ways and different from, in other ways, a lot of the Office programs. Very briefly, up at the top of the window, we will run into the ribbon interface, which works a lot like the ones in Word or Excel or PowerPoint. We can click on the various tabs up there to get to the various groups. There's a Help tab as well. And if we go to the File tab, we see we get the equivalent of the File menu and the list of the last however many files I've been working with as I've been teaching the classes. Over on the left side are the buttons for the three main views, the three main ways we can look at data which we bring into Power BI. The report view is where we do most of our visualizations, where we create our charts and our graphs and so on. The table view is where we can look at the raw data which we've connected to, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. It's possible to look at the tables individually, more or less the way we brought them in, and allows us, if we need to make some modifications. The so-called model view, however, is a little different. When you work with model view, what you're talking about is seeing, among other things, the connections or relationships between the tables. This is where having a little bit of database experience is sometimes helpful, but not required. The idea that two or more tables need to be connected to allow them to work together as a team, that's the best way I can describe it really, means that you get the right data from each of two or three or four or however many tables, because if they can talk to each other, say if they all have like an employee ID number for each employee in common, then you get the right data from this table, that table, and the other by making sure you get the employee ID number as the common factor. The space in the middle here, of course, is where we would add data to the report, where we, among other things, as I said, create our visualizations, our graphs and charts. And down here at the bottom, we can see that it'd be possible to add however many tabs for the equivalent of worksheet pages, if anybody here has used Microsoft Excel. Over on the right, however, is where things get a little more unique to Power BI. Because among other things, what they call the visualizations pane here, panel, you'll hear a couple names for it, is where we actually get the kinds of chart or graph we want to create. I frequently advise people that if they want to work with Power BI, one program that'll give them a little bit of a foot in the door is Excel, because in Excel, as some of you may know, it's possible to create charts, graphs, etc., pivot tables, pivot charts, that kind of thing. And although the technique here is a little different, the concept of graphing the numbers, graphing the data to make it easier to understand is still pretty solid, still a pretty useful thing. A picture is worth 1,000 words and all that sort of thing. So if you were to hover on any of the visuals here, you'd find that they tell you what they are. There's usually something like 30 of them here in the default setup, and it is possible to get more visuals later on if one wishes to do so. The visualizations pane can be tucked away, collapsed, or expanded, as can the filters pane, which allows us, as you might guess, to filter the data if we wish to do so. We cover that in our main class. The data panel is where we would see the tables from which we pull our data. In other words, this panel shows us which tables, which batches of data we've hooked up to, and specifically which fields are within them. This is where we would actually get the information to go into the visuals once we've established the visuals over in the main working space. Now, one of the peculiarities of Power BI, which seemed to strike me a little odd, but once you get used to it, it's not too strange, is the fact that if you want to open more than one file in Power BI, unlike, say, in Excel, you actually end up opening more than one instance of the program. Again, this is not a particularly, troublesome issue. It's just something we have to be aware of. So here, if I were to open a file, I'll just go to File to Open, and do my usual browsing sort of navigation. Put my files on my C drive for convenience here, and go into one of my data folders here, and analyzing data, and I've opened this file for class purposes as well. You'll notice that a second instance of Power BI is now opening, and if after it finishes doing its thing, I take a look down in my taskbar, you can see the two windows are showing up here. And if I now take a look at this newly opened file, I can see that I have no less than 3 tabs down here. I have one called Relationships, one called Sales by Region and Category, and another one called establishment data. And on each of these, we see at least one or two of these visuals. You'll hear visualizations. They're sometimes called visuals. Some people have to be snazzy and call them vises. You can call them graphs or charts if you wish. But the idea is that this is what we do with the data. And now, if I take a look over in my data pane, we see that we have no less than 5 tables established. And if we click the little twister arrows here, we can see the fields from each table, some of which will probably have check marks next to them because they're being used in whichever visual over there. We just have to scroll up or down to see which items might be checked or not. And we can tuck them away when we're finished looking at them. So this is one of the first things that we would want to be aware of is the general layout of the program. I'm going to talk about how to bring data in a little bit here, but I also want to talk a little bit about interacting with the visualizations once they are established. When you're first working on a visual, you don't have to work on it in this relatively small size. You can create the visual in a couple of different ways. And then if you hover on a visual, in addition to seeing the various screen tips popping up, we can also click this icon or button here called focus mode, which allows us to zoom in basically on one of our graphics or visuals. And if we wanted to do something with that particular visual, modify it, add things, remove things, we can do so while we are zoomed in. And then when we're finished, we can click the button up here that says back to report and jump back out. However, there's a little more to interacting with visuals than just zooming in and out. If I give a click on one of the sections of this horizontal bar, what I'm actually doing is filtering. Regardless of what may or may not be going on in the filters panel over here, when I click on a piece of, in this case, the horizontal bar, I am filtering. Click it again, as you can see, I turn it off. If I were to click on any element in one of these visuals, I am telling the program that I want to filter for whatever subset of data it represents. When I'm finished, I could just click a blank spot to deselect everything. This is very good advice when you're creating your visuals. When you're finished working on something, click a blank spot so you don't accidentally do the right thing to the wrong item. But if I were to go to the tab for relationships, here I just see a table. I can still go into focus mode. I can still work with the information. I could sort by customer name, or I could sort by product name, or I could sort by sales numbers. But the key point is that one way or the other, I can interact to some degree or other with almost all my visuals, unless I choose to lock one and prevent it from doing something if I don't want it to. Now, another point to bear in mind about these visuals, as we'll see here in a minute, is that, well, you're going to need some data in order to work with the visuals at all. This is a point which I try to make early on in the class, and it's no big surprise, but it's something that we do need to bear in mind. It's a very important point, because as with a car, you can have, one of the supercars like the Bugatti Veyron or a Lamborghini or something, and if you don't have fuel for it, it ain't going anywhere. It can go 250 miles an hour if you give it fuel. And as with cars and fuel, so Power BI with data. And that's just about as fundamental as you're going to get. Another thing which is helpful and which we explore in more detail in class is that you also need, for lack of a better way to say it, a plan. You want to make sure that when you're creating your visuals, when you're working in Power BI, that you know where you're going. It doesn't hurt to grab a piece of paper and a pencil and actually just sketch or write down some kind of outline, because if you're going to create a series of visuals, if you want them to even just, display some data, much less try and nudge people toward a course of action, having a plan is going to be helpful, if not critical. Having clear questions to ask. What do you want to know? And the more specific you can be about that, the better. Um, I'm not sure if there's an eloquent way to put it, but I tell people, if you have ever written an outline for a term paper or a research paper in high school or college or something, that's a good starting point for a lot of what we do when we work in Power BI. And there are a couple terms that occasionally run into for the types of visual we create. You'll hear exploratory versus explanatory. Exploratory meaning you'll just show people some data and let them draw their own conclusions, versus explanatory, where we talk about not just showing data, but saying, in essence, we are trying to work towards something. We are showing you this data because we have a problem or because this is working and we want to improve it. It is more than just a chart. It is a nudge in the right direction or away from a wrong direction. And again, that's a point which we try to cover to a degree in class. Now, when we want to create visuals, when we actually want to start, not necessarily from square one, but if we want to start from something like blanks or whatever, we would normally want to take a look at our data beforehand. So what I'm going to do here is actually close this instance of Power BI and don't have to worry about saving changes. Closing the file means closing that instance of Power BI. It doesn't hurt anything, as I said earlier. But now what I can do, just for a moment here, is to take a look at the file which I would want to open. This is not a requirement. This is not absolutely essential. But if you can look at your data before you make your connections, it can be extremely helpful. Because here, for example, we have an Excel worksheet. Here we have a comma-separated values or CSV file. And over here we got an Access database. Looking at the data, I'll open up my Excel file here, allows us to see, number one, if the data make any sense. Number two, if we're going to have to do any cleanup on the data. Number three, just to get a general idea of what the data are about. And if I go to either one of the two worksheets down here at the bottom left, we can see one called Orders. We have a fairly broad batch of stuff going out to column U for uniform and going all the way down to somewhere upward of row 2500 and something. And this batch of data is reasonably well set up. But if we look at the other sheet, this one here has a number of minor but potentially troublesome issues that we would have to work on. And this is most definitely something we cover in class. This is referred to as a data cleanup situation, because there are at least two or three things here which are not helpful in Power BI. One of them is that the first three rows of stuff in this worksheet are not of much use in Power BI. They are neither labels, such as we see in row 4 here, nor are they data, such as we have in rows 5 through 10. So in the course of bringing this batch of data in, we would have to do what's called a data transformation. And that takes some time. That's something that we go into in great detail in class. What you want when you're working with Power BI is something that looks more like the worksheet here called Orders, with just labels in the first row and just data in every subsequent row. Knowing that, if we now go back to Power BI, what we would do to start the process of bringing in the data would be to go to the Home tab, as you can see here, and we would go to the data group and tell the program that we would want to either get data from any one of several sources, or if we know it's an Excel workbook or a SQL Server or whatever else, we could click on one of those. One of the points that you want to be aware of if you're going to work with Power BI, and it's a good thing, it's a very positive thing, is that if you go to the Get Data dropdown here and you click on More down at the bottom of this menu here, you actually get a list of all the different kinds of data source that you can pull in when you're working in Power BI. And it shouldn't surprise us that the list is tremendous, because you want to remember that Power BI is a data analysis tool. We talk about business intelligence, data analysis. if you need to do data analysis, you better be able to pull a lot of different kinds of data source to do the analysis on. So you could see here, the list is tremendous. I don't even remember how many there are. There's like a couple of hundred different source types that you can get to. Most business situations, from what I've seen, they tend to work with about 3 or 4, maybe something like 8 or 10 at the most, different kinds of data source. But interestingly enough, over the last year or two, a fair number of my students have told me that the majority of the data sources they're drawing on are Excel workbooks. And I was curious to know why, and the basic answer seems to be that many data sources can export to Excel, and then because exporting to Excel means you've got relatively easy to use data, it's not too proprietary, means that it can be used for other things also. So if I click on Excel workbook and I click connect, it's going to ask me where the Excel workbook is. So now I just have to do the same navigation I was doing a moment ago. Here's the My Footprint Sports file that I was talking about. Give it a double click. And after a moment, we'll see another dialog box pop up, the navigator. This is where we would actually make the connection. There's a couple of different variations even on how this works. One of those is that I could go up here, and if you were to look very closely at these little icons here, you would see that we're dealing with worksheets. If you look very carefully, if you can see this on my screen, the little icons are telling me that these are worksheets. That is, they're not subsets of data like defined tables in Excel. Whereas down here under suggested tables, hint, hint, we have one of those. If I were to click this check mark, I'm actually selecting this table. Even if I don't click the check mark, I can click the name of the table and see that I've already managed to electronically filter out or eliminate those first 3 rows which contained non-useful data. This would be a good thing. But if I were to click on the worksheet up here, sales reps, you can see that I would then have some data cleanup to do because those first 3 rows, which contain stuff I don't want, are being pulled in. I would then have to, in the process, click the check mark, and instead of just loading the data, as you can see down here, I would need to click this button, Transform Data, and then go through a series of steps in something called the Power Query Editor, which allows us to do the filtering operations to clear out stuff, modify layouts, transpose from horizontal to vertical, and so on. And this is a lengthy but not really too difficult to understand sort of process. I won't lie to you, that's one of the things we spend a significant amount of time on in the class, not because it's PhD computer science, but simply because it does take time to make sure that one has done the filtering correctly. Basically go through it step by step and just take one's time and watch what one is doing. However, if I know that the worksheet called orders contains clean data, as they would say, which does not require a whole lot of work from us other than bringing it in, I could click the check mark for this one, and then instead of having to do any transformations, since we know there's nothing there but labels and data, I could now simply click Load down here instead of Transform Data. That's the usual if you know you have a clean data source. And after a few more seconds, we would see that batch of information show up in the data pane as the orders table, after which I can then click the little twister here, and I would be able to start adding the fields, the columns, from this table called orders to any visuals I create. In addition to Excel worksheets, though, if I wanted to draw on other sources, I certainly could. And the reason I wanted to talk about this a little here is because if you don't have data sources, you can't create visuals. It's as simple as that. Data sources are, as I said earlier, the fuel. So I would go to Get Data again. This time I could click on Text CSV, comma separated values. And it just so happens that I have a file called My Footprint Sports Customers there. Now, for demonstration, I'll minimize the window here for a sec, and I'll talk about opening this file, the My Footprint Sports Customers. It shows up as an Excel file, but I can right-click on it and open it with, for example, Notepad, because it's basically a text file. And, okay, it's being a little weird. Hold on. There we go. Here's the raw data. Now, this may look a little clunky to us. It may look kind of very dense and not very well defined, but as far as the computer's concerned, this is actually very well done. This is very neat, very easy to understand, because comma-separated values, CSV, means that we can find commas, and they tell us where one piece of data stops and another piece of data starts. So this first row of stuff, if we look carefully, is labels, and the stuff down here is the data. If I now go back into Power BI, get data, same routine as a moment ago, and just double click on my Footprint Sports Customers, the file I was just looking at. Again, the navigator will pop up, but this time, because it doesn't have multiple worksheets or pages or what have you, the information just plops itself right in there. And all we have to do is make sure that we have the correct delimiter selected, comma as opposed to tab or space or whatever else. And again, since we have nothing here but the raw data and the labels, this is clean, as they say, we can click load and the information will show up once more. Now, I kind of fibbed a little because I don't know if you happen to notice, the zip codes showed up without leading zeros. If you happen to remember how zip codes work, in part of the northeast of the US, the zip codes start with 0, like over in Massachusetts or in parts of New Jersey. So what we would have to do is a little bit of cleanup later on and tell the program, in working with this table, that we want to show the leading zeros where they were actually inserted. Because zip codes in our country anyway are purely numerical, the program can misinterpret that as quantities or values, as opposed to being labels like social security numbers or employee ID numbers or license numbers. So we have to occasionally sort of back check ourselves, and we can do that. But once we know that the data are basically showing up without any extraneous stuff, doing the leading zeros thing, a little reformatting, is not difficult. We can talk about that. And from here, once we've got our data sources in place, we would be able to go in and start creating our actual visuals. Now, I should mention that when you bring in data sources like these, there is one assumption which is being made, and despite some of the jokes about assumptions, this is an assumption which we should be able to make, and that is, if we're going to bring in data from multiple files, and even more if we're going to bring it in from multiple types of files, like, I mean, here, for example, I can go to get data, I could go to more, I could specify that I want to bring data in from an Access database. If I wanted to bring in data from multiple sources and multiple types of sources, the assumption would be that whoever created those data sources, whoever created those batches of data, should be able to sort of coordinate or otherwise communicate with each other. Because if I open the cabin rentals database in the navigator here, you can see that I've got quite a few different sources I could tap, a number of queries, and at least 8 or 10 tables there. But does any of this stuff work with orders for a sporting goods company? The answer in this case would be no. But the fact that we could bring in data from sources as far apart as all that tells us that the program is going to let us do whatever we need to do. Now, if I just decided that, this wasn't what I wanted, I could just click on the cancel button down here and get out of that. If I wanted to bring in any other data sources, once again, just get data, another Excel workbook, my Footprint Sports Sales Products, another of the Excel worksheets here. Double click on that one. Again, takes a few seconds to do its thing. And as you can see, I've got products and sales orders here. So I could click on each one. And in the process of clicking here, I can also widen the window a bit. I can take a look at the layout of the data, even if I didn't look at it outside of Power BI. And I can see that luckily these two tables seem to have the information in reasonably good order. The amount of cleanup I might have to do, the amount of data transformation would be fairly minimal. So I'll just check the two check marks here. And then at the bottom, I will go ahead and do a load. And as usual, this can take a moment. I should mention as a side point, if you ever find yourselves working with Power BI, one of the few things to be aware of, and some people have gotten a little nervous when they first start doing this, is that if you're working with very, very, very big blocks of data, huge tables, mind-bogglingly large chunks of spreadsheet stuff, the loading or reloading, if you get some updates, can take several minutes or more. One of the running jokes seems to be if you have to do a major load up of data, start the load up, go grab a cup of coffee, give it about 5-10 minutes, probably be done by the time you get back. And I always tell people, and I've seen this myself, I've seen very big blocks of data take 10-15 minutes to load and everything's still working fine. It's just if you're talking about literally millions of records, then yeah, it's going to take a little time no matter how fast your network is, no matter how fast your computers are. Once the tables are loaded, and we'll talk a little bit about cleanup here shortly, one of the first things that is considered good practice is to go over to the buttons for, as I said, the table view and the model view, and see if you need to do any cleanups. Well, model view first. When we click on model view, it actually keeps us in Power BI, but as we can see here, I'm going to tuck away the properties for a moment, what the program has done is to look at the tables of data which I brought in and tried to create connections among the tables. Why? Well, if I move the orders table as far over here to the left and up as I can, and then move the other tables around a bit so as to sort of clean up the layout a little, we can begin to see that there's a little bit of a method to the madness. Now, I can rearrange the tables to my heart's content. I can also zoom out a little to make it easier to have some room. And what I see is that if I arrange the tables properly, if I can sort of untangle them here, that all the tables seem to be connected in a couple of fairly logical ways. If we look very, very closely at the connector lines, we can see that there's a number one, on one end. There's a little arrow pointing toward the other end, and there's a little star on that other end of the connector line. And if I hover on one of these connectors, we can see which pair of fields is being used as the connection. The techno term for what we're seeing here is a group of, or a series of, one-to-many relationships. We also have over here a one-to-one relationship between sales orders and just plain old orders, and the connecting field is something called ID. The reason for these, as I said earlier, is that presumably whoever created these tables would know that the products can go into an order. The orders and the sales orders might need to be connected so that we can, be aware of what's going on in two different departments, like, just the order receiving and the shipping or whatever. And here's the table, My Footprint Sports Customers, with its batch of fields. But the idea that if a product has a product ID, that it should feed into a sales order. It could also feed into another table of orders somewhere. If we have customer data here, the My Footprint Sports customers, we can see that connector line talks about going from presumably customer ID to customer ID, or possibly something else. But if the fields are logically set up, you have customer ID here and customer ID there, then presumably those two fields should connect. The program looks for common field names, common data types. Are they both text? Are they both currency? and tries to make the connections accordingly. We can modify the connections, but if you have your data set up correctly, you shouldn't have to do that too much. If I were to right-click on one of the connector lines, I could even bring up the properties here, and I could manually edit the relationship if I felt the need. But making sure that the connections are there, whether you make them yourself or whether you let the program do it or whether you modify them, making those connections is considered one of the normal must-have steps, because otherwise, when you create visuals, either they won't show all the data you mean them to show, or they may show incorrect data. They may make certain assumptions about which data should show when, or you may get what amounts to repeat results, redundant information in a visual, which of course is no help at all. If I wanted to make modifications to my individual tables, I can click on the button for table view, and then over here in my data pane, I can give a click on whichever of the tables and make my changes. So here, my footprint sports customers, and I see that the zip code, this is something I talked about a little earlier, is not showing the leading zeros. I mean, here's an address in Lowell, Massachusetts. Massachusetts is part of region 0 in the zip code system. If I click the header for the column, we can see up here that the format in the column tools tab is whole number. I can change that to something else. But even more important than that, the data type, because the formatting is helpful, but the data type is what's dropping us out of those leading zeros. If I change the data type to text, after a few more seconds, I can tell the program that I then want to show the leading zeros. In fact, let's see, over here, data category, and see if we can find postal code. There we are. Takes a few seconds to do its thing. So one way or the other, what I would have to do is make sure that I specify things like data type, format. I mean, here I can go in and take a look at text, data category, postal code. That at least makes it aware of what kind of information we're dealing with here. And I don't need to summarize, meaning I don't need to worry about how many zip codes there are, but I can make at least a few of these kinds of modifications immediately. Here I can even filter or sort if I want to. And when I'm finished working on whichever field, whichever table, I can tuck away the information over here in the data column, in the data panel, excuse me, and go back over to my report view. There's obviously a little more to it than that, and when we work with the Power Query editor, we can do a lot more than what I've just showed you here in this very brief example. But now what I want to talk about for a little bit is creating the visuals themselves. Because of course, once we have the data, that's the next step. Once we've got the data to work with, I want to do stuff with it. Now, for this example, I'm going to go ahead and actually open a different file. Let me open that file first here. File, open, browse. And I'm just going to jump up to one of my other folders here. So visualizing data. Okay. Again, opens another instance just to save a little time. And what I want to do here is show you a couple of the methods for creating visuals. Now, basically, you can go one of two ways. You can pick one of the visuals from the visualizations pane by just clicking on the icon, which will start us up with a blank, and then add fields to it. Or you can go to the data panel, open up one of the tables, and start by just checking a check mark. The program will usually try to figure out which kind of visual is going to be the most helpful based on the type of data. But if you know that you need a certain type of visual, column chart, bar chart, pie chart, that kind of thing, it is actually a little less trouble to start by creating the visual and then adding fields to it. So that's what I'll do. I'm going to just toss in a new page for the heck of it here so we can start clean. And I'll go ahead and find the visual here for what they call a clustered column chart. I'll just give the button a click. And it comes up in gray with these kind of dummy columns. That tells us that this is waiting for us to give it data. What do you want to show? And what I would then do is go over to the data panel, open up, in this case, let's say the table of sales orders, making sure the visual is selected. You can see the little selection handles around it. I now go over here and click the check mark for the field called sales. And that tells the program I want to incorporate that field into that visual. But I'm not done yet. And I'll go into focus mode for the next part of this so you can see what I'm doing a little better. All I did was ask it to show the information from the sales field. I haven't broken it down yet. That's one of the other things. People initially see this and they start getting a little nervous because, all I see is a big column. What about my other data? Well, now what I would need to do is start working with the visualizations panel in a little more detail. I'm going to widen out these panels here so you can see this a little better. Because what I would now need to do is tell this first piece of information how to break down. And what I will then do is go to the table of customers, and in the table I will find region, and instead of just checking the check mark, which I could do, I'm going to drag it down to this thing here. This is called a bucket. It's one of the weird terms they came up with, called the legend bucket. And that breaks down the sales numbers by region. So even with just the two things there, the sales numbers and the region, we already have the beginnings of a useful visual. If I wanted to break it down further, I could go by country, I could go by state, I could go by zip code. But the key point is that I started by clicking the appropriate choice of visual and then adding data to it. Go back to my report here. Now, if I wanted to do something like start a visual of a line chart, I could tell the program that I wanted to use either the sales orders or the customers or any, really, I could use any of the things I want. But if I go to sales orders and I check the check mark, well, here, let me click a blank spot to deselect the one visual. That was another point to bear in mind. Deselect the visual when you're done. But if I now go over to the table called sales orders and I check the check mark for sales, the program assumes, for various reasons, not least of which this is a money number, that I want to do either a column or a bar chart again. What if I want a line chart? Well, the visual is selected, so it's paying attention. What I would now do is go over here and choose the different type of visual. In other words, change the visual type while it's selected. It knows to pay attention. Now I need to add some more information because, again, right now we're not seeing lines, we're just seeing a dot. So what I then have to do is talk about what should go into the x-axis or the y-axis or whichever else. Let's see, I could go to region and drag that down to legend. I could go to the x-axis and drag, let's say, find something relating to, let's say, the dates. Let's see here, order dates. There we go, here. Grab order dates and drag that to x-axis. It got a little busy because we have a lot of order dates. It gets looking pretty wild. But then I can modify the order date information. You can see how it even got divvied up by year, quarter, month, day. I can click the various X's here to remove the information that I don't want. I don't need to break it down by quarter, by month, by day, just by year. And so with just a few of these subdivisions removed, I've simplified the chart to quite a degree. And now, again, it's giving me at least moderately useful data. Another of the tricks, which some of you may be aware of if you work in Excel, is that a chart or a pivot chart needs to be relatively simple. You don't want more than 3 or 4 elements in it without a good reason, because otherwise you get mishmash instead of a usable chart. Go back to report. I could have done all of this while I was looking at the chart in the not focus mode, in the unzoomed in view. But the thinking is that by zooming in, by using what they refer to here as focus mode, we can work a little more comfortably and we don't get distracted by having several things on the page at once. Also, for those of us who don't have 20/20 fighter pilot eyesight, doing focus mode makes life a little bit easier. And you can always just go back to report and click a blank spot when you're done. If at whatever other point I wanted to add more visuals, as I pointed out a little while back, one of the questions that we would need to answer is, what do we want to talk about? And I have to reiterate, because this is something many of my students have found useful over the years, is that even aside from which program you're working in, the more of a plan you can come up with, the more of an outline, the more you can define clearly what you're trying to do, the better. If I want to just go ahead and create another visual, I can go ahead and create another visual. I can create a bar chart here. Click a blank spot, find the stacked bar chart, which is sitting over here. See again, program is saying, okay, what do you want to put in? I mean, heck, I can just grab the thing and reposition it wherever I want. I can grab the sizing handles around the edge, just like in Graphic and any other Microsoft program, make it bigger. And then again, I just go over and find whichever fields from whichever tables and just start either checking check marks or dragging them to the appropriate buckets down here. So if we want to turn on the check mark for sales, again, we see that single bar. If I want to get into my table of products and I want to check category, program is already now beginning to do a good breakdown. You can see it's sort of picking up on some of the ideas here. Could even find subcategory and add that. And almost before we know it, we have a stacked bar chart. If we decide that we want to move any of the items in the buckets, if we wanted to drag whatever else around down here, want to move something from place to place, yeah, we can do it. But the simplest way to create one of these when all is said and done is to just start by clicking the appropriate visual and then either checking the check marks if you want to see what the program says as far as where to put what, or drag the appropriate markers, drag the appropriate fields into the appropriate places in the buckets down here in the bottom of the visualizations. These are some of the main points involved in creating visuals in general. We have to start by connecting to the data sources. If we now have a couple pages worth, we can double click one of the tabs down there if we want to rename the thing, call it sales by region and category or whatever other name we want to use there. So sales by region and category. But it does help, as I keep going on about, and I tell my students this a lot, it does help to have a plan. If you want to sketch out approximately what you have in mind, that would be great. If you want to just write down what amounts to an outline, by all means, that's fine, whatever works for you. There are a couple more things I'd like to just briefly demonstrate before we finish up on this little webinar. One of them is the fact that if we go to the View tab, we can actually modify the theme or color scheme, if you will, for the entire Power BI file. We can modify the appearance of all the visuals in one fell swoop. And if we click the drop down here for the themes, we see that the normal install of the program will give us somewhere upward of a dozen of them. The one that we talk about pretty regularly in class is this one, Colorblind Safe. I don't know how many of you are acquainted with somebody who has whatever degree of color blindness. I know a couple of people who do. And the Colorblind Safe color scheme may look a little odd to some people's eyes, but it is much more readable to people who have, for example, red-green color blindness. It does not affect anything else that's going on in the file at all all it does is change the color scheme. If there were any graphics, any visuals on the Relationships tab, they too would be changed. The theme data will hit the entire document unless you specifically tell it otherwise, but generally keeping the themes consistent throughout the document is good, because in addition to being easier on people's eyes, as I said, if they have color blindness, it also is more visually consistent, therefore more professional. And yes, it is possible to create one's own themes if one has to abide by product branding standards or something like that. Now, a couple of final points which I just want to mention here before we call it a day. One of the other kinds of visual, if we look very, very closely, is map. And if I give that a click, let me make sure I select nothing here. Oop, didn't mean to add that. My apologies. If I make sure that nothing's selected and then click map, you can see that what I would now need to do is add data which includes geographical information, which I could get, for example, from customers. If I check the check mark for state, after a few seconds, and I can drag the, I want to drag the map, not the, drag the visual here, excuse me. What I've done is to tell the program that I want to look at data on a geographical basis. The dots tell me that I have, in this case, if I hover on the things here, the states themselves. But now I need to specify what I want those dots to show. So if I open up sales orders and I drag sales to legend, you can see that we are now looking at that popping up. But if I drag sales down to, say, bubble size, now the bigger the bubble, the higher the sales number. I need to talk for just a second about using maps, because this is something that a couple of my students have run into trouble on, no fault of anybody's. The map feature, although it's very useful, does require an internet connection. Not as big a deal as it would have been 20 years ago, but the reason is because the map data are drawn from an external site. If I remember correctly, it's from the website for Bing. And that means that if you're going to work with maps, you have to make sure that you talk to your IT folks about the business of opening a hole in the firewall or whatever to allow that information in. Actually, I think they may be using a couple of other sites now. Let me zoom in here a bit. Yeah, they may be using one of the GPS companies like TomTom, in addition to calling stuff up from Microsoft. But anyway, the key point on the maps is that you will need an internet connection. Otherwise, you'll get an error. It can be fixed, and we actually talk about that in class too. But one wants to be aware that Power BI does have a couple of requirements besides just how powerful is your computer, how many cores does your processor have, how much RAM do you have, how big is your hard drive, that kind of thing. We do have to understand that the program has these other little bits we have to be aware of. Anyway, I'll say a couple of closing words here. I just want to mention that obviously a webinar doesn't allow us to go into tons and tons of depth. I showed you here a few of the most important techniques, the must-haves, whatever you want to call them. But if you want to look into the class, by all means, take a look on our website. Let me also just reiterate briefly with my little slide deck here that the next couple of sessions will be early in March, and you are certainly welcome to get in touch with our office and ask further questions if you want to look into it. I will say that I've had quite a few people come in who were, I guess you might say, a tiny bit uneasy at first. Okay, the session should be available on our website. I think it might go to either our blog or to one of the other sections on our website. You could certainly ask the office. You could just get in touch with us at skillforge.com, and they'll let you know exactly where it should be on our website. It'll be there somewhere, I can tell you that. Normally, if I remember correctly, our recordings are made available, I think it's usually within a business day or so after they're done. So figure probably by Monday, drop the office a note, and they'll tell you where the webinars are located. You can certainly review them later on. I will also mention that, yeah. Oh, thank you, sir. Yeah, I've just been informed that the link will be a link will be sent for the recording to all attendees. Since we are tracking who's here, everybody will get a link regardless. So again, probably you'll be able to view it by Monday at the latest. So thank you for asking. Oh, and the boss mentions that it'll be available on our YouTube channel. So that definitely makes it easy for everybody to see. Okay. Let me just say, yeah. Oh, here. And if anybody wants to take a look, let me just mention, since I was, hold on one second. I'm going to put this in the chat for you. It's youtube.com/skillforge. That'll be us. So, okay. Just give that to everybody. Bear with me for 1 second here, please. I want to make sure I head that out to all of you guys. So yeah, to the person who was asking about that, to Ms. Scott, if you go to youtube.com/skillforge, again, should be available by Monday. By all means, take a look. But I'll also just say very briefly that aside from the business of getting a little bit of a foot in the door with programs like Excel to get the feel for doing the charts and the graphics, don't let it worry you if the appearance of the program is a little bit different from the stuff that we normally see in Excel or in Word or whichever. Because as with pretty much any other piece of software you work with on the computer, especially if it's all in the Windows environment, once you learn the ins and outs, I've had people tell me that it's not really much more complicated than microwaving mac and cheese. Not to be flippant about it, but there is a routine to it. There is a recipe, if you will. And as I say, I've had a lot of people tell me that once they get the hang of it, mainly it's just sort of going through the steps, making sure they know the sequence on the must-haves, and just practicing. And as a last point, I'll just say this. I mention that in almost every class I teach, that I can walk you through this stuff. I can explain things, always glad to try to do so. But practice is ultimately necessary with almost any kind of software, whether it's graphics, business intel, spreadsheets, even word processing. There are some things that one needs to be aware of, and one does have to practice a little bit. Okay. I hope everybody's been able to get a little bit of a foot in the door mentally on the concepts here. I hope this has given you a little bit of an intro, a little bit of an understanding of some of the basics of the program. And if circumstances allow, I'll look forward to seeing you in class at some point or other. Drop the office a note if you have any questions on registering for class or any further information you want. And of course, we'll try to help you out. And I'll see you in class. And obviously, great. Let us know. And, have a good weekend. Drive safe if you're driving. And I'll hope to see you again at whatever point. So take care, read, practice, ask questions, and I'll see you whenever I see you.